Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at Wilson. Today, we're launching a new policy paper on Lebanon as part of the Lebanon Ideas Forum, Building Lebanon's Sovereignty and the State. We're also discussing this paper throughout the day with officials and experts from the United States as well as Lebanon and the region. This paper represents a culmination of more than a year of research, a trip to Beirut and other parts of Lebanon last December, as well as various conversations with members of the public sector, with politicians, business leaders, economists, civil society leaders from Lebanon, as well as the diaspora. And so without further ado, I am honored to welcome our keynote speaker from the United States this morning, Congressman Darren LaHood, who serves the constituents of the 16th District of Illinois. Congressman LaHood is also third-generation Lebanese and is a strong believer in the importance for the United States and other key players in the region to support Lebanon and help it navigate its way to address the myriad challenges that it faces. So, Congressman LaHood, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me just thank the Wilson Center for the opportunity to be with you today. Marissa, I want to thank you and Ambassador Hale for the invitation to speak here today, and want to welcome everybody online and that are present here today. I know we're joined by, I believe, a member of the Lebanese Parliament, MP Hamadeh, so glad that he could be with us also. Unfortunately, as we meet today, Lebanon remains at a tipping point, dangerously close to becoming a failed state, something that I never thought that I would reference. The people of Lebanon are suffering. Unprecedented economic collapse, political gridlock, corruption, and a devastating humanitarian crisis continue to impact the daily lives of Lebanese people. I am the proud great-grandson of Lebanese immigrants who left I-2, a small village in northern Lebanon, to come to the United States through Ellis Island to live the American dream. They had no money, no education, no English, but like many other Lebanese immigrants, they worked hard, played by the rules, invested in their family, got an education, and have lived the American dream. They and many of their friends and family settled in Peoria, Illinois, my hometown. And I'm proud today to represent and be part of a dedicated and vibrant diaspora community of over 8,000 Lebanese American constituents. Today, as well as in the past, the Lebanese people have faced significant challenges that would leave many demoralized from a constant state of crisis. However, the resilience of the Lebanese spirit remains strong. In August of 2020, we were all left to witness the shock and devastation from the Beirut port blast and resulting collapse of economic and humanitarian conditions within Beirut and Greater Lebanon. However, the Lebanese people rose to the occasion, protesting in the streets of Beirut for change. The timely parliamentary election showed a remarkable shift in democratic participation and resulted in the election of many new members of the parliament, representing a movement for opposition and change to the status quo. Fast forward to October of 2022, when Michel Aoun ended his term as president, and Lebanon has been mired in political stalemate with 12 failed attempts to elect a new president. Unfortunately, this is nothing new for Lebanon, and failure has caused ongoing efforts for reforms to falter and corruption to continue. The irony of this is, this summer we'll have a record amount of people visiting Lebanon. Many families and people, you can't get a hotel, you can't get an Airbnb because people want to go back and visit Lebanon this summer. While we all understand the challenges of Lebanon's sectoral government, until there is an election of a president, the parliament cannot pass substantive reforms needed for international support and aid. This includes many reforms needed for the International Monetary Fund financial support, which many agree are vital to the survival of the Lebanese economy. We must not also forget the Cedra conference several years ago and the money that was promised there if reforms were made. The people of Lebanon deserve a representative government, not one caught in ongoing political posturing, and certainly not one caught up in an agenda to serve the interest of international proxies and malign non-state actors like Hezbollah. Hezbollah and Iran continue, in my view, to be a terrible influence on much of the Middle East. Whether it's support of the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia proxies in Iraq, the propping up of Assad, who's a war criminal in my view in Syria, supporting Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah's corrupt and undemocratic grip on Lebanon. The international community is watching closely what happens with the presidential election in Lebanon, and whoever that may be must serve the true interests of the people of Lebanon, not those of a political faction or non-state actors. In Congress, I'm proud to be the co-chair of the US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus. The caucus focuses on how to better educate and inform members of Congress on policy related to Lebanon. We also work on Lebanon-related legislation and engage with both the U.S. administration as well as many officials, NGOs, and civil society organizations within Lebanon. We are up to about 40 members in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats, that serve as part of the caucus. It is important to emphasize that many in Congress do not have an in-depth knowledge on the nuanced history of the U.S.-Lebanon relationship, including the history of the Taif Accords and the complicated politics of Lebanon. But long-standing support for the Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF, American universities in Lebanon, including AUB and the Lebanese American University, and long-term humanitarian assistance through programs like the American Schools and Hospitals Abroad program, among many others at USAID, have helped sustain a strong partnership to promote American values in the region, and we need to continue those. However, many in Congress view Lebanon through a lens of the influence of non-state actors like Hezbollah, political corruption, and sectarian violence. The continued delay in electing a president does not build confidence in the Lebanese government or the broader international community. While many partners around the world have been willing to support the people of Lebanon, Lebanon needs to help itself. Event after event that should lead to political change, including the refugee crisis, the near complete economic collapse, and the evisceration of many people's bank accounts, if not all, and the Beirut port explosion, have not yet triggered a substantive response from the government of Lebanon. While I do not believe that Congress or the administration should consider withdrawing support for the LAF or humanitarian support, we should be considering robust actions on serious measures, including a real discussion on the issue of sanctions and the Mazinski Act, focused on those who continue to subvert the constitutional proceedings of the government. This includes politicians and political parties and elites that undermine parliamentary and constitutional processes and prolong the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. I believe that the United States continues to have a vital national interest in a stable, sovereign, and independent Lebanon. But unfortunately, issues like the presidential vacancy stand in the way of substantive cooperation. I would also point out, we saw earlier this year a bit of good news for Lebanon, and that was the codification of the maritime border with Israel and Lebanon. And we should view that as a positive and good news for Lebanon that showed the world that Lebanon could negotiate an international agreement and sign that, protecting the oil and gas interests for the Eastern Med and for Lebanon. We should next carry that success to a land border demarcation and get that done. And I would also point out that, Lebanon is a long way from other negotiated settlements, but when you think about the broader Middle East and you think about the Abraham Accords, Several years ago, I don't think anybody would ever thought that Israel would be able to negotiate an accord with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. But it should give us some hope and optimism on why Lebanon can't achieve an accord like that to help open up economic opportunities in Lebanon. The US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus will continue to push the Biden administration to emphatically support the election of a president who will represent the needs of the Lebanese people and move forward on political and economic reforms. The path forward for Lebanon is a challenging one. To that, I am not naive. However, the Lebanese people can no longer afford for the political elite to drag their country even further down the path of a failed state. I am glad that groups like the Wilson Center continue to put forward substantive ideas and have dialogue on how we can be proactive on policies related to Lebanon and support the Lebanese people. I will continue to work in Congress with my colleagues to spread the values of democracy around the world. Lebanon has the potential to be a success once again. However, that will only come when their government and the political elites work for the people and not for the interests of the corrupt or the malign. I hope that through ongoing work to combat corruption, substantive policy solutions on how to support the Lebanese people and the Lebanese government stepping up to help itself and be responsive to the needs of the citizens, that we can continue the historic partnership of our two countries. I want to thank again the Wilson Center and you, Ambassador Hale, for hosting me today. I look forward to continuing to be engaged on many of the issues related to the U.S. policy in Lebanon moving forward. Thank you all.
I'd now like to welcome our keynote speaker from Lebanon, a member of parliament and former minister, Mr. Marwan Ahmadi. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us from Beirut. It's afternoon in Beirut, so we look forward to your remarks. Tfaddal.
Thank you. Ambassador Hale, distinguished guests, dear friends at the Wilson Center, allow me first to convey my deepest thanks to the Wilson Center and my good old friend, Ambassador David Hale, for giving me the opportunity and the honor to address such a distinguished audience through the wires on a subject that has been haunting the Lebanese people, their closest brothers and friends for decades, not to say for centuries. Building Lebanon's sovereignty and the state. The term building is more precise than rebuilding, so often used in our rhetorics, with glimpses of sovereignty recovered as testified by inscriptions on Nahr al-Kalb. It was never preserved, and less of all, never did we reach a real solid state erected on the grounds of beautiful principles, promising messages, and exceptional conviviality. Every now and then, despite the linguistic interest, customs, and geographical ties, various communities sought hegemony on the smaller and then larger Lebanon. The Druzes, with the princes of Tanukh and Man, the Christians with the French cultural and political influence followed by an international mandate, the Sunnis that took advantage of Egypt's Nasser's and Palestine Arafat nationalistic, charismatic influence, each one and then took over not the government of the country, but the government of the affairs of the country. Now come the Shias, with that overwhelming ideology, coupling with a millenary religious feud with the long-lasting Persian aims of expansion. In the meantime, demography changes, weapons domination, charismatic leadership of Hezbollah's leader, we have to recognize, insidious infiltration in the country's institution, murderous acts all over the last decades. All the ingredients were there with us, with no real opposition by other components of the society. Out of fear, laxism, corruption, or vested opportunistic interests. It is no wrong to say that arms inducted, then protected corruption. The state failed before it was proclaimed so. The port explosion was in fact a morbid announcement of this failure. And yet for years, 4 years after Tehran proclaimed its takeover of 4 Arab capitals, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a, something starts to quiver, to simmer in Lebanon. Beirut is no more the docile capital. Hassan Nasrallah dealt with for years. The president he contributed to impose is gone after a catastrophic 6 years mandate. The government is interimary, almost inept to expedite the current affairs. And the Hezbollah majority in parliament has vanished since the 2022 legislation. Also, despite Lebanon's fatigue that hit all our Arab brothers and all our international friends, David Hale is a witness on that, voices have raised, initiative has been taken, committees have been formed. Even the impasse in parliament shows that the Shia duo may block everything, but cannot impose a president, even when some European and French phantasm of Iran's relations are still there. Of course, this is just a step. And the Doha communique 2 days ago reflects the changing moods of the Arab and international community towards Lebanon. The Taif Agreement is back in the picture, and the constitution is no more a wholesale good for the militias to grasp like they did in 2008 in the Doha shameful settlement that followed Hezbollah invasion of Beirut on the 7th of May 2008. This is why I use the term yet. Dear friends, allow me a brief historical recall that was maybe inspired by Congressman Darin Lahoud. I want to tell him that I too misses its wonderful American Lebanese congressman. Allow me this brief historical recall based on the ill-fated diagnosis and aiming for a natural redemption. We have to recall the major events that failed the genuine balanced Taif approach, starting with the institutionalization of Hezbollah at the expense of the more tolerant and moderate Amal group. The destruction of the Christian forces' immunity, which instead of providing Taif with a balance of forces, were beleaguered by General Aoun's wars against the Christian militias on one hand and Syria on the other hand, while he was secretly negotiating his own empowerment as president. It resulted after the first Gulf War in the total takeover by Hafiz Assad of our destiny. Lebanon had entered the Taif era with a shattered equilibrium. Hence, we paid the price all through the Syrian hegemony and now the Iranian upper hand. In the meantime, the terrorist cleansing of the country scene had started. Rafiq Hariri, other martyrs of the Cedar Revolution, as a platform for the July 2006 war, were used all as a platform for a further clampdown on the government, the total monopoly of the war and peace decision-making, the de facto erasing of the borders with Syria, and the shaping of a permanent alibi for the weapons, the Shaba farms. In another major chapter, we cannot ignore the constitutional breaches, especially the ones affecting the fundamental introductions, specifically the articles defining the Lebanese state as one in its definitive final borders, which is a Christian long-lasting worry, and defined in parallel as an Arab state in both identity and commitment, a historical Muslim demand. The fact also recognizes the system as a democratic parliamentary republic. So, as we come to the critical scene today of Lebanon's sovereignty in this exchange we have thousands of miles apart, give me a moment to communicate my mood here from Beirut, despite the full beaches and the new restaurants. We feel here how deep is our crisis, how gloomy is our perspective. Never have we reached the brink of such an abyss. I have been a witness and sometimes an actor of Lebanon's events unfolding for more than half a century, from civil wars to regional wars, with its share of killings, destructions, massacres, displacement of population, massive immigration, and moreover, significant changes in the internal balance of power and cultural affinities, translated by disrupted demography and the shattering of the basic terms of coexistence. Ambassador Hale, our host today, is certainly the most distinguished and designed personality to assess the dramatic transformation of Lebanon from a promising message of conviviality and the relative folkloric democracy with various portions of sectarian clientelism and entrenched corruption, but also with glimpses of freedom of speech and faith, diversity in political expression, a crucible the Middle East was never familiar with. Are we a hopeless case? No. I'm not here today to pronounce the obituary of the Republic of Lebanon. But it is with great regret that I have to formulate a most regrettable announcement. The experimented French-sponsored state proclaimed in 1920 on the stairs of the Résidence des Pins by General Gouraud has lost its major vital signs. No borders, no constitution, no working constitutional instruments, executive, a paralyzed legislative body, a moribund administration, a crumbling judicial apparatus, two armies, one legal, the other totally illegal, and the ignoring, total ignoring of all rules and laws, taking our present and our future hostages of a distorted ideology with false pretext of liberation of Palestine. An Islamic State looms out of the God's party aims, with, unfortunately also, secessionist trends developing in the Christian areas and circles. Here we stand. The 1926 Constitution, French-inspired, is ignored. The 1943 National Pact, on which the independence and the future of a free, neutral, balanced Lebanon is breached. The 1989 Taif Agreement, which brought an end to the civil war and paved the way for a more pacified, robust, liberal, non-sectarian republic, is now vowed to hell by those who want more hegemony and those who want less unity. This is the danger. This is where it stands. Federation, extensive decentralization, national guards here in every district, which would justify the perpetuation of the overarmed Hezbollah militia, all the false dreams and phantasms the Lebanese game of power are overcasting our hopes for a reunited, reformed, rejuvenized Lebanon, holding to its 1920 Great Lebanon limits. It's very important, and re-establishing the inevitable checks and balances without which the country would fall again in so many endured wars. A division, whatever the shape, whatever the repartition of population and weapons, would necessarily lead to endless war, much like we lived between the two Kaymakamats in the 19th century. 20 years of continuous war. The white paper drafted by Ambassador Hale and his team is of high precision, very up to date, and as an old-timer in Lebanese tragic mishaps and unduly praised glorious reconciliations, I would very sincerely, David, adhere to it. It is absolutely imperative not to succumb to the voices of those who raise only the flag of economic reforms. Of course, these reforms are indispensable, but this would mean ignoring that a state without sovereignty cannot adhere to, adopt, or implement any kind of reform. Civil peace comes first. It will generate, with the return of law and order within a cohesive state, it will generate social resurgence and also a just settlement of salary scales, debt issues, IMF recipes, and depositors' rights. It is not a matter of priorities, dear friends, but of a vital parallelism. Ignoring the Hezbollah problem, as some do, by mere political opportunism, or just succumbing to long-lasting weakness syndrome, leads to mask and eclipse the proper diagnosis of the Lebanese crisis. It will not produce a miraculous settlement of that crisis. Sovereignty is the key to reform, and reform the gateway to redeeming the Lebanese state. And evading this equation through electing the wrong president or launching a distorted debate will perpetuate the ordeal and in the worst scenario, lead to the implosion or the explosion of the 103 years old republic. Of course, the regional and international environments are presently of no real help. Lebanon faith has historically been linked to its regional status and its local repercussions. It did never look so grim. A drowning Syrian state still governed by an Alawite minority, bloody, sectarian, aggressive, a religious expansionist Iran, a triply messy and divided Iraq, an ultra-right Israeli government, an indecisive Western policy versus hostile and nasty Russian attitude toward the Lebanese crisis. These are not good omen. So where we stand today, a complete stalemate blocks the parliament from electing a new president. Torpedoing a quorum has become, since 2006, has become the way used by the Shia duo, they call themselves now the National Duo, and their occasional Christian allies to distort the formation of governments, the vote of legislative text, the Q&A debates within the House. The Hezbollah recipe is simply a simple result of the weapons supremacy. When they hold the majority, they impose their will. When they lose the majority, they block any decision. The white paper we had the privilege to see from 24 hours is not just a reference point. It is worth endorsing with a few remarks or additions. I have brought some, but of course it will keep in all our proposal to avoid the risk of a violent conflict inside Lebanon on both its southern and eastern borders, because this would bring a total collapse of the country. We are therefore called not to blow up the essentials of a Lebanese surviving state and reconciled society. The Taif Agreement, vocally accepted by all, secretly disavowed by many, must remain the fundamentals of any further formula, to be eventually, then later, negotiated or renegotiated and amended only after the restoration of the weakened state and electing this iconic presidency, the only Christian presidency in the Middle East. The government should therefore follow, supported by all political groups, but not composed of any flagrant partisan figure. The time for real technocrats has come, but the stability of such a formula depends on a real political balance of power, leading to independent administrative appointments, starting from the governorate of the central bank, just expiring now, to the army commander, to the judiciary chiefs, the main security heads, and the civil directorates. For that purpose, I suggest the full implementation in priority of Article 95 of the present Constitution. The text is clear. The purpose is legitimate. 1. The appointment of a High Council for the gradual abolition of the community rule. This council is headed through the Constitution by the President of the Republic. 2. The creation of a Senate, which would reassure the religious communities on the issue of representation, whatever the number. This is critical, as demography is leaning to a Muslim majority that threatens the no numbers rule adopted after Taif by late Prime Minister Hariri and late Shia religious chief Shamsuddin. A new electoral law for the lower house will then become conceivable and acceptable. 3. The implementation of a balanced administrative decentralization with some financial arrangements, not total financial independence that would lead to partition. Mild security measures on the level of counties, election of Kaza chiefs, sheriffs, and local district attorneys, anything that alleviate the burden of the state on the areas, but also keeps a united Lebanon until maybe another formula is later discovered and accepted. These steps, together with the full respect of UN Resolution 1701, I will personally say 1559, eventually going back to the 1999 Armistice Agreement that guarantees Lebanon's southern borders on both sides of the demarcation lines, and the delineation of the borders with Syria after the mass denial of the Ba'athist regime of any Lebanese sovereignty over recognized lines. These steps would allow any new government to recover local and international confidence, at least partially, essential to any further economic recovery. As suggested in Hale's white paper, pressure should be applied to enable the Lebanese state to regain control of borders, ports, airports, with the support of UNIFIL wherever needed and possible. This would allow the recovery of custom duties, VAT taxes, and other public dues. Moreover, it would transfer the guarantee of the revenue of offshore energy from Hezbollah and Israel ad hoc treaties to the Lebanese states and the United Nations. This is where the creation of sovereign wealth fund, actually discussed in the National Assembly, is a condition for protecting the future energies. Honoring our debt, ensuring our future potential for the sake of the next generations, putting brakes to the massive emigration is all linked to this quiet, promising approach. Even the settling of the high-cost presence of the Syrian refugees crisis depends on the recovering of sovereignty attributes. Borders permeable only to Captagon and other drugs cannot check movements of individuals and re-inspire confidence. I want to conclude by calling on ourselves, we Lebanese, to assume the responsibility of our fate. As called upon by the Doha communique 2 days ago, to tell Hezbollah enough is enough without plunging the country into civil war. And this can happen through political and civil resistance. This is where brotherly Arab and foreign friendly concern and pressure is required. We have been too often sold in the regional auctions involving Iran, and I do not trust the present so-called agreement with Tehran. Never was a promise fulfilled, and never was a guarantee kept. This is why what we ask from your governments and diplomats is really a real umbrella for Lebanese consensus based on regaining the balance of power. As long as Hezbollah believes it can do everything with its weapons, will get nowhere. I don't call for an immediate attack on weapons. This is not the issue. But recovering political equilibrium will, at the end, bring a defense strategy involving anybody's weapon besides the states. But I also admit this will only be possible if somebody in Beirut is ready to carry the task, is ready to accept the challenge. It might look maybe dreamy, but really there is no more place here for warmongers or for cowards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Ahmadi, for your excellent remarks, and thanks to both our keynote speakers for outlining the steps forward regarding addressing all the challenges that Lebanon faces. We're going to take a very short break before our panel begins. I just also wanted to inform our online audience that the policy paper is currently online. For those of you who are with us here in person, you can use the QR code to access the policy paper. So we can move on to a short coffee break and then come back in without your coffee cups in the auditorium, kindly. And thank you again for joining us, and we will be reconvening at 10 a.m. sharp. Thank you. Welcome back to the Wilson Center's conference, Building Lebanon Sovereignty and the State. I'm very excited to introduce the next panel, starting with the moderator, Joyce Karam, who is a senior editor at Al Monitor. Welcome,
Marissa.
Joyce.
Thank
you so much for joining us today. Ambassador David Hale will join the panel and also present the key findings and recommendations of the policy paper that we launched today. And with us in person is, of course, our dear colleague from USIP, Senior Vice President at USIP, Mona Yacobian. And joining us online are Fadlo Khouri, who is the President of the American University of Beirut, Renda Slim, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Program at the Middle East Institute. And last but not least, Alain Bifani, who is formerly with the Ministry of Finance, but currently president of the Lebanese Citizen Foundation. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Joyce, to kick us off. Before actually you kick us off, just a reminder to our online audience that you can insert your questions or comments in the comments section or tweet at Wilson Center MEP, and we will be collecting all of these questions and handing them over to Joyce for the Q&A session. So over to you, Joyce. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you for the Woodrow Wilson Middle East program for setting up this excellent panel. You know the panelists, some of you better than I do. And I'm very glad to be here to be discussing a topic that's not getting enough attention from policymakers, from the mainstream media. We are here to discuss a new report from MEP, Building Lebanon's Sovereignty and the State. It's a great read. I do recommend it. It's somehow ambitious. It has very good recommendations on how we move Lebanon out of the state of crisis and paralysis. As you know as well, endemic corruption. The country doesn't have a president since October. The government is a caretaker government. The chief of the central bank is under investigation. His term is due end of the month. And the parliament has met so far 12 times without being able to vote for a new president. So To discuss all of this, of course, Ambassador Hale, a good friend, Mona Yacoubian. We have Randa, Fadlo, and Alain joining us online. So we have very little time, and I don't want to drag this out too much. So I'm going to start with you, Ambassador. The report itself, I found it very interesting because it's direct, it's clear, to the point. At the same time, these priorities that you lay out are ambitious, a package deal, amending the Constitution to avoid future presidential void, decentralization. Give us your overview of your assessment of the report itself. I know you went to Beirut in December to work on this. And is this a realistic document going forward?
Well, thank you, Joyce. I certainly hope so. But before delving into the report, I want to really commend the keynote speakers that we just heard. I thought from their different perspectives, they really gave us the right context for this conversation. Congressman Lahoud, not only a pillar of the Lebanese American community, but also reflecting growing frustration and impatience on the Hill with the impasse in Lebanon and growing activism, which I think is very welcome. And of course, Minister Hamadeh, who all of you I'm sure know by reputation anyway, if not in person, is one of the great statesmen in Lebanon who's been involved in mediation efforts going all the way back to the beginning of the Civil War, and himself has suffered greatly at times for that. In terms of the report, we tried to get away from some of the usual analysis. I think we're all familiar with the situation in Lebanon. We also did a report a year ago on the economic and financial problems of the state, so we didn't really want to dwell too much on that. Very deliberately used the phrase building sovereignty in the state, as Minister Hamadeh mentioned, because Lebanon, sadly, because of its complex demographics and power sharing arrangements, has always had a weak central state. And while we tried to be realistic, it's interesting to hear your observation that it was ambitious. The Wilson Center, of course, does not have a policy goal of its own. This is a forum. We want to inspire discussion, and we felt that these were some of the key issues that needed to be put to the table. And I hope that our panel will be able to delve into them and pick it apart and offer other ideas as well. But my own experience in Lebanon goes back to really 1988, and every presidential election is fraught, but it's gotten worse and worse every time, it seems. And it always is resolved with some kind of package deal where there's give and take. So we felt it was important to acknowledge that and make the point that the vacancy's bad, but getting the wrong president could be even worse. And so you have to, again, the trade-offs that will come with the nature of the president will also entail these other issues that we raised in terms of government reforms and representation and the electoral law. And we also wanted to, I think, touch on a key question, which is why is Lebanon, of almost any country you can think of, have vacancies in its presidency? I mean, this is an anomaly that surely can be addressed and should be addressed, and it is not a partisan question. I mean, it is a gap in the Constitution that we felt should be discussed. But the real heart of the report is trying to tackle the issue of sovereignty, and I think Minister Hamadeh really framed that very well in terms of the problem that Hezbollah poses, existential problem for the state, and it's not going to go away with a magic wand. And so we outlined the ideas about a gradual but concerted and persistent effort by Lebanese and by international partners of Lebanon to not stop demanding return of sovereignty at the ports, the border, and the airports for the reasons that the minister mentioned.
I want to go to Randa Slim on this point. Randa, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. On the point of Hezbollah, you do mention that the disease is the absence of sovereignty stolen namely by Hezbollah. Randa, you know Hezbollah better than anyone. Having viewed the report, having viewed the recommendations, how likely do you think Hezbollah would accept any of it? Easy question, yeah.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the Wilson Center, Marissa, and Ambassador Hale for hosting me today, and thank you for this excellent report. I think the diagnosis of the problem is correct, which is the loss of sovereignty. The question is how to regain it. Right now, the incentive structures of the political players in Lebanon and the rest of the elites, and I mean by that Hezbollah, but everybody else, are not structured. I mean, they are not in favor of altering the status quo. They are approaching negotiations through a win-lose mentality where each party is defining their win in terms of the loss of the other side. And so the question is how you can move them, whether it's the regional parties or the international community, how they can move them from win-lose to win-win. That's extremely hard to do in any negotiation, and in any complex system like Lebanon, it's going to be very hard. And while reading the paper, Joyce, I was exactly asking the question that you just asked to myself, saying, and after listening to Mr. Hamadi in terms of his excellent roadmap of how to go about that for the solution, is what are the incentives of Hezbollah to go along with that? I mean, I look today at the situation. I mean, if you listen carefully to Nasrallah's latest speech, there were two red lines that he identified. One, their weapons arsenal cannot be touched. Two, there will be no negotiations on the land border. And primarily, the second red line is related to the weapons, because when there is because the whole narrative about the resistance is that there are these disputed, border points that require resistance. So once you have negotiations, especially if it's successful on this, the whole narrative is undermined and underpinned. So basically, the red line for Hezbollah remains the weapons arsenal. And I don't see how sovereignty can be regained if decisions over this weapons arsenal, as well as decisions over war and peace that commit Lebanon to entanglement in foreign wars, as has happened with the Syrian civil war, are not retaken back by the state. I hear very well Ambassador Hale's excellent argument. This has to be a gradual approach. And we have tried, and how you change usually cost benefit structures, you try, and how do you change behavior? One tool has been sanctions. Sanctions have not worked in Lebanon. They have not changed the behavior of the parties, including Hezbollah. And the other tool is public pressure from up, which is going to increase the cost for their behavior on the political leaders. I was hopeful about that in 2019. I was hopeful about that after the port crisis. That public pressure has today disappeared, or it's very reduced. And what we are seeing, and I thought the economic crisis will be that kind of incentives for change in the regime, in the parties' behaviors. Again, as the report says, referencing the World Bank, we have a normalization of the crisis, and people are getting accustomed to living with, and you have the expats, remittances, 38% of the GDP, helping create a safety valve for Hezbollah and the other parties. And so I totally get the paper, I totally get the recommendation. The question is, how are we going to change Hezbollah's and others' incentive structures? I don't see how right now without a concerted regional and international campaign. I mean, let me just end by saying, I was talking the other day with a friend about how the Soviet Union in the 1989 fell apart. I'm not saying Lebanon is the Soviet Union, but really there are three factors that eventually led to the implosion of the Soviet Union. One is the rottenness of the system. The system was very rotten for a long time, and so it was not going to be sustained. Two is the international pressure, especially from the Americans, constantly, not only sanction, but also dialogue. There were a lot of dialogue, even during the Cold War, with the leadership. But then three, it was the mistake committed by the Soviets with the Afghanistan invasion, which and I thought, okay, let's bring that back to Lebanon. The system is totally rotten, right? Totally rotten. The question is, the international pressure, I think it is on and off. It's not sustained, especially from the United States. And we need more of a concerted international pressure using a variety of tools, including sanctions, but more targeted sanction. But then three, it's the system itself has to commit this catastrophic mistake that makes the rottenness unacceptable anymore and unsustainable. I don't see that happen right now. I mean, they are very careful, including Hezbollah, of committing that kind of mistake.
That's definitely an interesting point. I would even go further, saying the situation inside Lebanon is, when it comes to food shortages, to medical shortages, it's way worse than the Soviet Union, even though I've never visited. But Dr. Khouri, to you, Randa mentioned 2019, the protests, the activism that we've seen. You championed those. We've seen you take part in some of the rallies. The report mentions critical reforms that need to be undertaken. 4 years later, where is the 2019 movement? And the same question to you: how do you convince this system, this functional elite to accept some of these reforms?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I should say, from a point of clarification, I'm an educator, a physician, and a scientist, and not a political analyst. So Randa has forgotten more about the political elite than I'll ever be able to learn, as is David. I should start by thanking both David and Marissa for inviting me. To clarify about the 2019 protests, look, we're a university. Of course, we advocate freedom of speech and self-determination. But remember, we're also a university where the different political parties at the time had significant representations, which they lost. I mean, they're much weaker on campus because of their behavior 2019 and subsequently. But what we've championed is the right of the Lebanese and the people of the region, the Palestinians, the Syrians, Jordanians, and others, to self-determination, and to think of themselves as not children of a lesser God waiting for Deus ex machina from the US, France, and other supportive countries, shall we say, or interested countries to come rescue the situation. What the agenda we've consistently pushed through the universities, and this is the discussion we had, the rector of Saint Joseph, Father Salim Dakash, and myself with the former president, several prime ministers, and the speaker, was about the need to listen to people and to give them the opportunity to pursue a future in their own country, as opposed to continuing to strengthen the 200-year plus old Lebanese instinct of emigrating under social, economic, and political pressure. I don't think the situation now is as bad as the Civil War. You hear this all the time. Worst situation ever? No. The Civil War, which I lived the first 7-8 years of, was worse. People were dying. And the reality is that the Lebanese are very capable, unfortunately, at accepting their fate. And you're seeing medicines coming from Turkey, from Jordan, from other countries. And frankly, the system has not collapsed from the education and health system. It's badly deprived. The question is, how do you get to the elites? I think, to be blunt, sanctions have not worked. I agree with Randa. They just haven't worked because they've targeted people who, at the end of the day, are not the ultimate decision makers. I think in the last few years, it was an unpopular view of mine. I think David may recall this in DC, 2017, 2018, 2019. I thought the sanctions were hurting the Lebanese banks and the Lebanese more than they were the culprits who were being sanctioned. So the problem is you need a fundamental rebuild. If I could piggyback off Renda's theme, you have banks that didn't lend, didn't invest, but put the money and were buttressed by a central bank that built what we now all know to be a pyramid scheme. To rebuild Lebanon, you need everyone held accountable. And that goes to the fundamental tenet of citizenship. Citizenship is not just belonging, but accountability. when the Lebanese elect the same people, in spite of the situation they're in, they're showing a lack of accountability for their children's future. So part of it is to elect people who listen, who feel accountable, and to feel accountable yourselves. And that's where I think the role of the universities and the schools has been badly underrated. Not to say we haven't been supported. The US in particular has stepped up to keep the private higher education and education sectors from sinking further. We've gotten more support the last 3-4 years than we had for decades, which we're very, very grateful for. But it's on us to teach basic civics all the way from elementary school through college. And part of civics is there's nothing wrong with having a hyphenated identity. You can be an African American, an Asian American, a Latinx American. There's nothing wrong with people having a sectarian identity. If they want to be Shia Lebanese, Maronite Lebanese, Sunni Lebanese, Druze Lebanese, let them. But they need to understand what the construct of the country is. Part of that is telling the truth, which I have to agree with Marwan Hamadi, that the 1920 Pact set Lebanon on a course for failure because it gave too many people the right to veto progress. And that's why the Taif Accord, which has many constructive things, its time is expiring, but certainly the National Compact, which I believe was rotten to the core in that it dictated the president is Maronite, the prime minister is Sunni, and the speaker is Shia. Even from a business perspective, it's a failed pact. You choose the best person, female or male, gay or straight, for the job. Otherwise, you're at a business disadvantage. And to continue with this failed national pact is something that's implied in the white paper. So if I could just comment on the white paper, which I think makes a lot of sense in some areas. But if you talk about the fundamental issue of arms of Hezbollah, which I'm not an expert on, that I have no idea how you resolve it. But the other issues, you need to resolve them with things like, yes, protecting. I think it's very important to have a sovereign wealth fund that's absolutely protected. I think it's very important to have a banking system, which isn't discussed enough. That's a modern banking system, not a banking system in which people take money and put them in the banks and then the banks don't spend them. You need to invest money to make money. The US and Japan are two of the best examples of highly indebted countries that are thriving, whatever people want to say in the media. And Lebanon needs to go into the right kind of debt to succeed. But no one will invest until the fundamental issues that are outlined in the paper from the Wilson Center are at least seriously addressed. And to put pressure on the political elite, who I try to keep my distance from, well, they all have resources outside the country, which is probably their pressure point. And all of us recognize that the way to get them to play ball is to go after their assets outside of Lebanon. Now, the Europeans have long hesitated to do this. The US has been more forthright. And I think if you want to put pressure, you get the Americans and Europeans lined up to freeze the foreign assets of the decision makers. That will send a message if you want them to hear you. Until then, they're going to take this to an end game, which nobody wants. Of course, this month the central bank governor's mandate expires. I think there's very little chance he gets renewed. I'll leave that to Alain. But under international sanctions and investigation of this order, in December, the commander-in-chief of the army's mandate ends. So you could have a caretaker government, no central bank governor, no head of the army, and these guys won't bat an eyelid until you go after the things they really care about. And that's going to take political will. And one thing I love about the paper is the US needs continued engagement. It doesn't need to solve things, but it needs continued, consistent engagement. Because in my opinion, Lebanon and the Lebanese are extremely valuable, produce waves and waves of highly successful people. You don't need 20 or 30 or 50% of them to stay in this tiny country. You keep 10, 15, 18% productive, give them an incentive to stay in the country, and invest in the things they're doing. You will have a dramatically different Lebanon, and you'll have people with political and economic leverage. So I tend to favor the long-term plan that protects the assets, as you say, the ports, the airport, the sovereign wealth fund continues to invest in the universities and the schools. The schools are critical, but looks at building a real model of citizenship so that people can one day step up in the way that this generation of political elite will never step up unless you go after their foreign assets.
Thank you, and a shout to AUB, an institution that's still a beacon of hope, not just for Lebanon, but for the region. Just last week, we reported its the top 200 global universities. So thanks for all you do on that front. Mona, Dr. Khoury mentioned the U.S. role. And the report sort of mentions, it skirts around it. The Biden administration is a little bit more hands-off. We've seen the French are being more proactive, and whether freezing Riyad Salam's assets, returning it to the Lebanese. What is your assessment of the U.S. role, and what does the paper? What is the recommendation? Do they want more sanctions or just more proactive engagement?
Thanks so much, Joyce, and thanks to the Wilson Center for the invitation, and congratulations, Ambassador Hale. I think it's an excellent paper, and I commend you in particular for moving beyond what many of us do, which is admiring the problem and diving deeply into concrete recommendations. Joyce, before I answer your question, I want to add just a couple of contextual points that I hope will enrich the discussion. The first is just to, from here in Washington, colleagues in Beirut, I think, know this, and the Lebanese people do, but I want to underscore the depth of the social crisis that the country is enduring, and in particular, the impact on children, who are the future of Lebanon. I would underscore, I just want to put out a few statistics which I think are pretty staggering when we consider that Lebanon was once considered a pretty solid middle-income country. With respect to children, food insecurity, 3 out of 4 Lebanese children under the age of 5 live in what's called food poverty. 25% of children under the age of 5 live in extreme food poverty, which means that they're vulnerable to stunting and wasting. Child labor is now an issue in Lebanon. It's apparently almost 9 in 10 households do not have enough money to buy their essential goods, with 15% stopping their children's education. And the country is also in the throes of growing inequality. As it goes to a black market dollarized economy, this is actually widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So I say this to underscore the urgency of this, because these are structural changes which, if they're not addressed, can really lead Lebanon, I fear, to a point of no return. Second contextual point is just to underscore, and my colleagues are saying, but I think it bears repeating. This is not the typical political stalemate that Lebanon has endured, with various confessions battling for who's going to be president. To my mind, given what I just said about the statistics, this is a crisis that really underscores, I think, the contempt that Lebanon's ruling political elite has for the Lebanese people. The fact that they would sit in the face of this type of suffering and do nothing to address it, when we all know the answers of the reforms that are needed are very clear. Congressman Lahoud, I think, laid out quite well the ways in which this political class has refused to address and put in place the needed reforms. So I think it's important to underscore that. With that being said, I think here's where I see the U.S. You rightly note, I think the Biden administration's attention on Lebanon has been fleeting. It's been kind of up and down. I would note, and it's been noted already, that when the United States does put its full attention to something, it can solve problems. So Hochstein's mediation of the Lebanon-Israel permanent maritime border is just one example of what can happen when you have engaged, creative diplomacy. So I really think we need to have a much more consistent, and I would say high-level engagement on Lebanon. Secondly, I agree with what Dr. Khoury just said. I have that in my recommendations as well, which is what we need to see, in my view, are coordinated, and by coordinated I mean US, French, Gulf, Arab, targeted asset freezes and travel bans on all those who are obstructing progress toward the election of a president who will serve Lebanon's interest and will begin to put the country back on a path of stability. Last point, I think we do need to be more creative in thinking about how to work with opposition elements in Parliament. It hasn't gone anywhere, but is there more to be done with that core of MPs who seem quite interested in addressing exactly the challenges that we're talking about today?
And is the opposition even unified, or are we
Well,
seeing,
Can there be,
splintered?
can work be done to help unify them, help build consensus?
So those are very good points. Alain, I want to turn to you. You're the only one on the panel who actually served in the Lebanese government and the Ministry of Finance. The report makes clear, that there should be genuine embrace of the IMF reforms. In that context, when you were in government, when you were at the Ministry of Finance, did you, was this crisis inevitable? Because the reforms were not there then. And what are the prospects of an agreement with the IMF? If we can get
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, David, Marissa, the Wilson Center, for an excellent and very pragmatic paper. The main story here, even if we're talking about the IMF, is not economics, of course. So I'm going to build on the paper, if you don't mind, and argue that it is not political paralysis that hindered policy implementation. The political elite's plan was to do nothing, willingly, not because of the paralysis. With or without institutional deadlocks, nothing would have been done anyway. One cabinet didn't dare to, and the second didn't want to. The clans wanted the population, specifically the fragile parts of it, to take the losses on their behalf. And when the cabinet was fully in charge, it never tried to move forward with reforms anyway. And this would have made the most powerful contribute to the recovery efforts, which they don't want to. The government issued from the clans wants the normalization of the state of crisis, as the paper says, precisely to avoid any IMF-led package and any deep reforms that would jeopardize their grip on the country. I mean, it cannot care less about the growing informal activities, even if it will be extremely challenging to reverse the trend, and really doesn't mind the wide inefficiencies created by the cash economy precisely because of its, because it favors legal activities. And many members of governments, and I want to stress on that, are demolishing the very institutions they are supposed to build and strengthen, and through them, the state itself altogether. So in a lawless state, a minister with full powers could be worse than vacuum. Thus, it could be useless to focus on one single issue in Lebanon, such as the presidential election or the government formation, if those in control disregard constitution, laws, and institutions. So on the assessment, I would emphasize that the country is permanently going down because it keeps reinstating the same people who are often involved in the massacres the paper refers to. Then there are very important points. I agree Lebanon should not continue to rely on immigration or remittances. This unhelpful theory is fueled by the clans who benefit from getting rid of the middle class that could ultimately challenge their position. On migration, the Citizen Foundation will publish in the coming days a detailed and worrying study regarding Lebanon that I urge you to read. There is a reference to tough love conditionality. I love it. It is certainly a must. Lebanon was led to catastrophe by those donor conferences that provided free money to a corrupt system. Also, I'm a strong supporter of the package deal approach, but there's a need for a stick to enforce policy reforms. And we have to be vigilant regarding the contents of the laws that will be passed, as they are often counterproductive and do not bring the expected results. People don't act on good faith here. Targeted sanctions, clear texts to be voted, and practical details regarding implementation should all be part of the mix. I would also argue that the constitutional amendment regarding the presidential election doesn't harm, but it is not enough, as the constitution is permanently flouted. And I'm in total agreement on the incremental approach to establish sovereignty. Now, on decentralization, beware the revenue distribution formula among areas, as the system should not disincentivize productive sectors. And a lot of capacity building will be required. And by the way, regalian functions, where most problems lie, will remain at the central level. So interesting, yes, but not the answer to all evils. And now on economic and finance, restoring confidence requires concrete measures. I mean, it's the real end of banking secrecy, the auditing and cleansing of the central bank, a full asset quality review of banks' resolution framework, unifying the exchange rate, and other measures. And all of that was included in the government plan that we prepared in 2020, and that the same politicians who are in charge now sabotaged back then. So unless they are forced to, they will continue to postpone reforms using all kinds of pretexts, such as, remittances, Syria's reconstruction, or just imagine if we find gas in the onshore, in the offshore. I mean, that would be the utmost catastrophe.
So the
On
sabotage was happening before the crisis, you would say?
Oh, definitely. Then talking about the equitable issue that is referred to, I mean, the violent bashing that we took was precisely, we wanted the system to be equitable and take some from those who benefited most. And on the central bank, the new governor will need to work with everybody, restore confidence, be firm but fair, make sure to minimize the harm on everybody and turn the page, specifically turn the page. It will require courage to announce the size of the losses incurred by depositors, while disinformation campaigns continue to mislead them. And then on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, we proposed at the time a Norwegian-style fund, but the text was buried, of course. And it is critical, as the paper emphasizes, not to use those assets as revenue. It is not revenue. We have to avoid Dutch disease. And the last thing to be done, for instance, is to start spending right, left, and center, or to reimburse the debt with those assets. On the Lebanese Incubator Fund, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've myself started the Creative Nation Fund, which presents a solution to de-risk investors from the country risk and boost the entrepreneurs ecosystem, support an incubator, create quality jobs in Lebanon. And I think that this is a great initiative. And maybe on the sanctions, I agree it should not be a substitute to policies, but it remains a very useful tool if they are well targeted and even if they need some time to bite. And as Fadlo said, we have to go after the things they care about. And then, on the issue of American-Saudi alignment, I think that nowadays it is even more critical than ever. And that kind of alignment will make it way easier to move forward on any reform agenda. Finally, on the conclusion, I like very much the conclusion. Perhaps I could stress the importance of building a strong judiciary from scratch and credible media that are both critical for checks and balances. And we need international pressure to be sustained. Thank you.
And that was my next question to you, Ambassador. Two things in the paper. One, American-Saudi-Lebanese partnership should be reestablished. The French have tried, the US ambassador has tried, your successor. Do you see any inklings that the Saudis are more willing to engage now in Lebanon than before? And then if I can have you weigh in on the question of decentralization should get a hearing. What do we mean exactly by decentralization? Is that the question of federalism? How would it work in reality on the ground?
Sure. Before I answer your questions or tackle them, I did want to thank all of the people on the panel for, I agree with virtually everything I've heard. You could write a 100-page paper to try to cover everything. And the persistence of U.S. policy, the need for persistent involvement and engagement, not overarching and overly ambitious attempts to fix everything, but not neglect. And I've written a book on American diplomacy toward Lebanon coming out in a few months, and that's basically the theme, looking historically at this oscillation. And we will do much better, I think, if we even out and stay engaged. I also want to touch on sanctions because my last job was under Secretary of State, so I was looking at sanctions at a global level. And I have very conflicted views about them because too often they really do become a substitute for policy because it's something we can do in between military action and sort of talk. But we don't always measure the results, and we don't recalibrate to see what's working and what's not working. We tend to just pass them, walk away, sometimes don't even enforce them as effectively as you would want. The other thing I worry about, and who could not disagree other than some of these elites, about freezing their foreign assets, right? But if you freeze all the foreign assets you can get, guess who still has their assets? Hezbollah. So you have to be careful about thinking that, yes, Lebanon would be far better suited if we started to tackle these sort of former warlords who are now no longer have weapons, but they have these other assets. But what would actually be the outcome of stripping all those people of power and those communities of power without replacing it with something that's truly democratic and responsive to the public? You would end up with Hezbollah and the Iranians because they have protected their assets. They are immune from all of this, unfortunately.
So the political solution, the political push has to come before, the economic.
It's a combination of things. And I do think that the sanctions are most effective when there is a plausible threat that you're about to impose them. That is the moment in which a leader or an actor may choose a different course of action. And you have to provide that alternative course of action as well. Back to your question, to me, on Saudi Arabia, we've worked very effectively with our Saudi partners at times on Lebanon. And there are other times where the Saudis have kind of given up. And I think my perception when I was ambassador there and subsequently is that they're in the give up mode. They really don't see strong partners, certainly in the Sunni community. And they kind of have they should speak for themselves, but at times I see a black-white, if Hezbollah has any say-so, we don't want anything to do with Lebanon, whereas I see that as ceding the field, unfortunately, to the opponents. So I think a more nuanced approach is in order, and obviously the state of the U.S.-Saudi relationship influences this as well, and that's a work in progress. Your other question was about the decentralization question, and Marwan touched on this. There are as many flavors of decentralization as there seemingly are Lebanese, and so you can go from a very narrow administrative kind of decentralization where people are taking care of their own day-to-day needs through municipalities, which would have to have their capacity substantially improved, to a more vibrant vision that a lot of people have, particularly on the Christian side. In response to Hezbollah's domination of the scene, they kind of want to pull out. And so it turns into a sort of autonomy federalism scenario, which has to be debated by Lebanese and not by people like me. And I think we have some people in the audience who might ask questions about this when we turn to them.
But does that, this is sometimes overinterpreted, misunderstood, and sometimes it creates a lot of fears that this is calling for the fragmentation of the country. What's the difference?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not an advocate of this proposal, I want to be clear, but the people who are advocates would say, well, Lebanon already is fragmented. And so if the 1920 state is in such dire conditions as some of our panelists have said, then what are the ways in which you can acknowledge the fragmentation but channel it into structures that reduce the potential for conflict? So I think that's what people are struggling for.
Randa, I want to go back to you if you can show Randa on the screen, please. So the paper mentions the issue of, one of the few that mentions quite bluntly the issue of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and it acknowledges it's becoming a very toxic situation that's hurting both the refugees and the local population. Having followed this issue yourself, what is the off-ramp for this issue? I know the EU Parliament just voted to block against efforts to forcibly return the refugees to Syria before conditions are suitable for that. So if we can have your take on this issue.
Thank you, Joyce. I think the refugees now represent an existential crisis for Lebanon. They are not the cause of the crisis, where it is. Let's put it out there. I mean, this populist narrative that they brought Lebanon to where it is. No, it's the elites, their corruption, both in the business sector, in the political sector, in the financial sectors, and years of that have brought us to where we are. Years and decades. And so, but today the refugees, in terms of numbers, about 1.5 million estimated, of which 800-some thousands are registered with UNHCR, are definitely in terms of numbers, but also in terms of sectarian makeup, represent a major threat to the social fabric of the country. I think the principle of non-refoulement has to be sacrosanct and has to be accepted. However, at the same time, we have to understand that of these 1.5 million, a large number, I don't have the numbers, are economic migrants. And so there needs to be a reckoning through some work involving Lebanese civil society, Lebanese government, and the UNHCR in identifying these categories of refugees, which are economic migrants and which are truly refugees that deserve the protection and need to stay in Lebanon because of threat to life and threat to their security. That's the first step. However, the much maligned European Commission, European Parliament vote has in fact come up with a very interesting recommendation. The report, in fact, calls for the establishment of an international task force, including the EU, including the UN, including the Lebanese government, including other donors, especially from the region, to discuss the issue of refugees and come up with some creative solutions, for the refugees. Look, at some point, the countries in Europe, in Canada, maybe in the US, others have to step up and start taking in more refugees. The latest number I heard of how many refugees were taken from Lebanon and by 13 countries, it's dismal. It's in fact shameful. So they need to step up to the plate and increase the numbers of resettled Syrian refugees from Lebanon. I know the political consideration in many of these countries prevent a rational debate on this issue, but it needs to happen. But on the other hand, I think there needs to be this international task force to be established among all these parties that I just mentioned, including the Lebanese government, to discuss these issues and discuss a roadmap. This is, the status quo in Lebanon is just unsustainable. We're already seeing violence targeting communities of refugees. It's going to increase. As the economic situation, as we all know, is going to get worse, they are going to become even more and more target of this. Now, will that involve a conversation between the Lebanese government and the Syrian regime? Should it involve a conversation on the issues? Yes, it should involve a conversation. Now, does the Assad regime want these refugees back? You think rationally he would want them back for reconstruction, but really he doesn't want them back. So the question is, we have to tackle with, I don't see a short-term to medium-term pathways for return of most of the refugees, because partly the Syrian regime does not want them back. Unless they can monetize it, unless they can get a lot of money for that, maybe they'll take them back. But even then, they just got, in a way, Assad got the people he wants. He doesn't want all these people who have created all this trouble, in the past for him. So he doesn't want them back. So Lebanon is going to be stuck with them for a while. The question is, how can we help Lebanon with this issue? And this international task force is one way to do it going forward. There is no short-term to medium-term, answer to it. I think you are going to see more and more of the Lebanese population, of the Lebanese politician, trying to abuse and use this issue for their own political purposes, which can create violent acts against refugees and discrimination against refugees. But there is no, but it's on one hand, but on the other hand, it's unsustainable. The level of opposition inside the population to the Syrian refugees now crosses sectarian boundaries, crosses economic strata. It's pretty prevalent in the country.
The language is also getting very very bad and just very, very toxic rhetoric. But yeah, thank you for that. I don't think we have immediate fixes. As Randa mentioned, the government in Syria is not eager for the return of the refugees, and the situation inside Lebanon is untenable, while the Western countries, we hear a lot of, lip service, but then there is no actionable solutions also to lift some of that burden. Dr. Khouri, I want to go back to you on you've mentioned the question of, I like the bringing in new blood, emphasizing the question of citizenship, civic duty, and all of that. But when you look at at our elite in Lebanon, I mean, my God, it's, whether it's the head of the parliament or the caretaker government, and we don't want to offend anybody, but there is no slight chance of seeing any new blood or anything in that. And the candidates that we're hearing their names being floated for the presidency, yeah, it's people we've seen on TV since I was 2 years old. So
seems familiar, doesn't it?
Right. So next year we'll see. But yeah, how do you overcome that? Is there any chance that maybe this presidential election can bring a consensus new candidate that brings in some of that qualifications that you've mentioned?
Thanks, Joyce. I appreciate the question. Briefly, look, we all know the adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but you certainly can't teach an old dog who doesn't want to learn new tricks. And in my opinion, as you implied and just about said, none of the people you're talking about are going to do anything good for the country. I think that's quite clear. I was dismayed to see sorry, David, I'm not the most tactful person. The now number 2 in the State Department praised the Speaker of Parliament for what? I still don't know. But to be very candid, you do need new blood. And whether it's going to be a new president, I'm not as optimistic in the short to intermediate term, Joyce. I think in the long term, I am optimistic, because even the children of these folks are a little bit different than them. Are they different enough? No. But I do think what you're seeing is the kind of social pressure they have to not be involved in politics. That's true for many of them, not all of them. I do think that a new type of political creature, a new civically minded Lebanese leader is starting to emerge. Are we going to see it in time for the next presidential election? I'd be very surprised. I don't think we can do much worse than the last 6 years. I'm not blaming one individual, but it was an absolutely catastrophic, dysfunctional 6 years, arguably the worst, or certainly one of the worst in Lebanese history. And to go back to Alain's point, it's not that they didn't know what's coming. They knew perfectly well, and they chose to let things crash. Look, it's now well known that in late 2018, early 2019, the rector of Saint Joseph and I approached the president and the prime minister with our data, which suggested that just from our student bodies at AUB and Saint Joseph, financial aid was going up, need was going up, Lebanese were getting poorer. And it was time for, and Alain remembers this time, a national emergency 6-month technocrat government. We were very clear to the president and the prime minister that a political government without extreme will would fail and fail badly. They chose to go with the government announced in January of 2019. You could argue, what the heck are 2 university presidents doing getting involved in politics? We didn't do it with any political ambition in the classic sense. We saw, and I think everyone saw, the economy crashing, the social crisis worsening, and it was time for them to step up, and they deliberately didn't step up. They founded a government, they formed it with many, many distinguished names, and they couldn't even finish a meeting. So I think there is no chance of teaching these old dogs any tricks, because they will take it to the end of the road. So is there hope for the future? Yes, there is. We're seeing some quality people in parliament. To go to Joyce's question from earlier, not to me, to David, can you get them to follow a planned, unified agenda? I'm not impressed so far, but I think there is a long way to go to give them an opportunity to get together and to at least come up with a reasonable compromise candidate who starts the process of a national sort of even competent government, a clean and capable governor of the central bank, and to start with some of these necessary reforms to, at a minimum, protect the most dangerous game. And in my opinion, we didn't talk about this. The most dangerous thing right now is that the end game isn't just continued stasis. The end game is that these political elite, as you like to call them, they're anything but elite, in my opinion, other than financially, get their hands on Lebanon's public domain. They get their hands on the port. They get their hands on the airport. They get their hands on the public assets that, through almost 50 years of dysfunction, the state still owns. And that's what I think is the most important thing to keep out of their hands. Don't let them take over the public assets. And as long as the US, France, Saudi Arabia, and David, I agree, they're in a period of saying, when, our high-level friends there say, well, we invested $300 billion in this country, we have zero return. So they claim they're looking at it from a business perspective. If there can be a consensus to protect the public assets for future generations, that is a very important start for the international community to safeguard.
Thank you, Dr. Khouri. Mona, we only have maybe 6 to 7 minutes to wrap up our conversation, then go to the audience. But I do want to ask you, the report was something, endearing. I found that how resilient are the Lebanese people and how they're adjusting to the situation, whether it's, some people have become vegans and vegetarians, and then others, you see solar panels all over the country when, the electricity sector is failing. But when we look at the Lebanese military and security forces, are they appropriately adjusted in your opinion? And what are the threats that institution could, be part of the fragmentation that we're seeing?
Well, thanks, Joyce. I'll be very brief. In my view, the Lebanese armed forces are the one institution that is standing between this country and total and complete collapse. They are certainly not without fault, but I think that they play a critical role in enforcing stability at this time. And without them, I fear the country really could descend into all-out chaos. So I would just underscore the important role they're playing at this moment.
Thank you, Ambassador. I do want to go to you on that point, but I want to go to Alain so he gets a chance to weigh in as well. Alain, if you were in the room today recommending policy changes, what is on the financial, the financial sector that you would advocate to happen immediately to prevent, as the report says, the situation is bad but can always become worse?
Well, the first thing would be to let the market and the laws play, their role, because for now the game is, people are cheating on the game, and that requires various issues to be taken. I'm not going to go into the details. And the other thing is to normalize the situation between various stakeholders. We cannot continue to pretend that the situation is going to just adjust by itself. At some point in time, the law has to prevail. Normal solutions have to prevail. Shareholders have to take the losses before depositors. creditors have to play their roles, and so on. So it's really about normalizing the situation and making sure that there is the beginning of a state of law that imposes itself on the financial gain.
Thank you. Ambassador, just if you can weigh in on the Lebanese army. You, as Undersecretary, as Ambassador, you've made trips to Beirut to deliver some of that aid to the LAF. How stable is the LAF today? And then I do want you to weigh in on the, some countries have, dropped names that they would recommend or leak names, this person or that person to the presidency. And then they've walked it back. We haven't seen the U.S. enter in the name game. Is this a question about a person, or as the report mentions, this should be just much more? And many of the names that are being debated, so if you can touch on that as well.
Well, I don't speak for the U.S. government, of course, just to clarify this point. And going backwards from your questions, we don't name names. Typically, even if the United States does have a candidate in mind, it won't name names because it doesn't want to create the impression that the United States is delivering those names or that candidate. There's also a phenomenon in which you can burn very good candidates by naming them, right? The name has to appear to come organically out of the Lebanese process, even though we all know there are regional and international factors that are going to contribute to the outcome. And it's going to be part of the point that the white paper makes, is that it's not just about a personality. It's about a whole package of what the orientation that the Lebanese people, to the extent you can measure that, want their country to go into. Which brings me back to the army and I think a critical point that Randa Saleem made at the beginning, which is we can talk all we want about stability and sovereignty and the state of Lebanon, but how do you get Hezbollah to, if not cooperate, at least no longer be eroding the sovereignty of the state? And there is no answer to that question. We don't provide it because there isn't one. I think what you have to do is change the trajectory. And unfortunately, since the 90s, and then again after the June war with Israel, the trajectory's been in Hezbollah's favor. They have the initiative, the Iranians have the initiative, and we are seeing the consequences of that. It's not at all the state of Lebanon, it can't all be blamed on that. But it is, without that change of trajectory, we will get nowhere. So we've got to start building contexts that impede that. And the army is a critical piece of that. Not that the army is going to stand up to Hezbollah, that is not in the cards for the stability of Lebanon. But if you don't have a viable army, then there is no alternative, and Hezbollah will gain even more than it has already gained in strength. And similarly, by taking away from Hezbollah its access to port revenue, airport revenue, the control over the borders, and there's a lot of smuggling, as you know, going on, that is a way to begin a process of reorienting, making sure our friends, even if it means holding their nose, like the Saudis, about their discomfort about Lebanon, they need to be engaged as a counterbalance. The Iranians aren't going away. So where is the other counterweight? And it is missing. So it is about building a context. And it requires persistence, patience, and once you're starting to build that, other opportunities and chances may occur along the path that we can exploit.
Just a yes or no, does the current economic crisis, the prolonged crisis, do you see that as strengthening Hezbollah?
Yes.
Okay, well, on that note, we can move to our audience questions. I have few already coming, streaming here, and then we'll alternate between the audience in the room and those coming online. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand, and we'll turn to you. We'll do one here and one there. So the first question, if that I think would be a good one for Randa. What prevents the Shia community from peacefully but openly breaking free from Hezbollah's grip and publicly denouncing them? Anonymous.
That answers the
There's
question.
The answer.
Where is Randa? Did we? Oh, there is.
Yeah. One is fear, because people that have broken Shia, who have broken with Hezbollah, have paid with their lives or have incurred enormous losses to their businesses, threats to their families. Fear is a big driver. And they don't feel that the state will protect them if they were to go against. But the other factor is that you have a large contingent of Shia who believe in Hezbollah. They believe Hezbollah brought them, brought visibility for the community, guaranteed their political interest. And what you are seeing now, which is very interesting, is a shift in the country's political economy in favor of the Shia community. I mean, if you look at the segments of the Lebanese population that are profiting from the economic situation today, whether it is through the arbitrage, with the Sayrafa, or whether it is through illegal activities like, drug trafficking or providing logistical hubs for the Captagon industry from Syria, or through money laundering, thanks to the cash economy, a big part are the Shias. And you have the Shia business community in Africa, which is doing pretty well and sending remittances. But you have a lot of poverty, of course. The Shia are like the rest of the Lebanese suffering. But let's put it this way. What Hezbollah is going for him and for the Shia is that they are suffering less than the other communities. And that's the criterion for Hezbollah. It's not like we have to solve it. As long as our people are suffering less than the others, they can. And so it's a fear. In conclusion, it is people who believe in the ideology, core, what I call the core Hezbollah believers, and there is a lot of them. And there is, people who are benefiting from the cash economy, and they are feeling that Hezbollah is, helping protect that cash economy.
Thank you. And why don't we go to the room? I think the gentleman.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say amazing panel. Thank you.
If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Muhammad Muazzin. I'm with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So thank you so much for this panel. If you don't mind, I have a two-parter question. One for Ambassador Hale, one for Estez Khoure online. Ambassador, thank you so much for all your work. And one thing that I wanted to ask you is, given the unfortunately complicated nature of Lebanon's history, with a lot of the bloodshed that's happened ever since the breakout of the civil war, and as you've alluded to, the involvement of multiple parties throughout the region, is from a diplomatic standpoint, if the international community wants to help Lebanon, how do you break through that animosity of, if this person who's aligned with the Shia community, this is Iran's doing, or if this person who's aligned with the Christian community, this is America's doing. How do you break through that almost conspiracy-like mindset to actually affect change? And for Estez Khoure, from what you mentioned about the merit-based elections, is how do you balance the sort of sectarian nature, the inherent Shia-Sunni Christian Dirza divide in Lebanon, with how do you balance that with a merit-based form of elections? Sorry for the two-parter.
Thank you. Very good questions. Ambassador, why don't we...
Yeah, thank you. Well, that is a key question. And we try to get at it maybe a little bit sideways, so it's easy to misread what we wrote. But the beginning of the U.S. policy international context, the first recommendation we make is that Lebanese leaders have to get their act together first, and then go to the international level to seek, as I think Marwan said, an umbrella, and to line up as many people as you can behind a plan. And when Lebanese leaders are incapable of doing that, and of course no one's in charge in Lebanon, and there's such a high level of disarray, it's very hard for the Lebanese leaders to come up with, not a consensus, but at least something that has momentum. So you end up with a lot of confusion. And I've always been struck in Lebanon, people often there impute a behavior or preferences on the part of foreign actors that don't even exist. People say, well, we all know the Americans back X. And I said, well, actually, I don't think so. Oh, yeah, you do. You're just not saying it. Well, okay. But that's part of the problem, is there's a Lebanese expectation. They want an ally to come in to counter an opponent that they have on the ground. And the only real way to get over that is for Lebanese to develop stronger consensuses among themselves.
And Dr. Khoure, on the question of merit in elections and bridging that sectarian divide?
So I think, Joyce, when we convinced our board to restore tenure, we made a business proposition. And I think the business proposition to the Lebanese people to get rid of this sectarian catastrophe goes as follows. I'm going to try to be brief. So you have a completely catastrophic state in which maybe 1 out of 10 of your best and brightest children, maybe 1 out of 20 get to stay in a very close family unit. However, as Dean Acheson wrote to, I think, President Truman, when he suggested, David, you know this data better than me, to float Saudi Arabia in the 40s until its oil wealth could be developed. And then they came to the American University of Beirut to build the first engineering school in the region. So the great wealth of the second half of the 20th century was fossil fuels. The great wealth of the 21st century, if you look at the 10 wealthiest men and women on the planet, is intellectual capital and creativity. So human capital is the oil of the 21st century. And Lebanon will have both. They'll have fossil fuels and tremendous human capital. So the question then becomes, how would you like to exploit your greatest assets? By continuing to give the same clowns who play this sectarian music, aren't you tired of it? Or wouldn't you like at least 20% of your children to live in dignity here and for you to have a better quality of life? Look, you have to frame it as a simple economic and social question. And that is that the National Compact has failed. The idea that these three sects deserve any head start over the others is gone. And you open it up. And a recent proposition to start with a transitional state by a former minister in which the parliamentary elections would no longer have sectarian denomination. So it's just by district. And the president for 2 cycles is a Christian, not a Maronite, but a Christian. And the speaker and the prime minister are Muslims, I think is a proposal worth thinking about. Enough of this failed game. You have to tell people the truth. I don't think you're attacking one sector or another, but you cannot continue with this. It's not just about meritocracy, to my friend who asked the audience. It's a simple, practical economic and social reality. And I think once people are faced with that, with time, when their children are educated, come up with the same argument, I think the National Compact fades into the dustbin that it should have been in some 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, thank you. And if I have a question also to Dr. Khouri from that's coming to us online. You've mentioned the media and media outlets. The question is, do they have a role in creating change, or do you think they have become part of the corrupt system, Lebanese media scene?
Look, I find it unfair to hold the Lebanese and Arab media to standards that the US and European media don't meet all that often. I think to ask for absolute objectivity is ridiculous. What we want is more credible media stations, more credible journalists. I'm not just saying this because you're here, Joyce, like you, like others, who will report the news as they see it, give their opinion, instead of going for alternate facts and non-truths. I do think the media has a tremendous role to play if we're talking about the basis of a future Lebanon being citizenship. And it's an underinvested in area. You've had several very distinguished media outlets. Remember, Lebanon was famous in the entire region for its press, particularly the written press. This needs to be invested in, and not just by people who think of it as a plaything.
Thank you. If we can go back to our audience, Dr. Jubaili here.
Joe Jubaili with the Lebanese Information Center. I want to address an issue that may not be too popular, sad reality, the role of the Lebanese electorate. I think maybe, David, you hinted to it a little bit. Lebanon is still a democracy, so people are voting their representatives. And the reality is they did vote before to the people who were pro-Hezbollah. And that was one way for Hezbollah to actually control the country politically. And in the last election, despite what Alain and Dr. Khouri mentioned, that the reality were in front of the people, that the ones in charge were the ones destroying the country. Still, they were able to maybe not win the majority, but still have a significant representation in parliament. I want to caution against the idea about new blood, because we have, according to the some statistic, we have about 50% of the parliament who are new members of parliament. So, and I would rather go with the what Mona was talking about, an opposition that brings together maybe old and new, rather than just talking about new blood, because there could be a real reformist, but also some who would be more loyal to the old elite, if you want to call them, in the new members of parliament or new blood. I have a question for Dr. Houri when it comes to the reality that I mentioned. And we've done some statistics. We've seen that over 60% of Lebanese abroad who were allowed to register, there was a lot of obstacle, of course, to prevent them from voting, who actually voted. And it took them a lot of efforts for them to vote, whereas we see only about 40% of Lebanese residents who voted. And I know that the AUB and maybe others did some statistics on the electorate. Is there any explanation why these people refrained from voting? And those who voted, is there any statistics that or explanation on why they voted this way? I'm talking about mainly the one in Lebanon, because the one abroad, most of them voted for the opposition. It was very clear. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not a pollster, but I'll tell you what I'm aware of. First of all, you have 25 members of parliament who probably aren't really aligned, okay? And that's a start. That's the most Lebanon has had a long time. You have to understand, as I think we all do, that Lebanon will never have a two-party system. You can have a cluster, the so-called March 8, March 14 clusters, but even these are fluid. If you look at the diaspora that were allowed to register, you're right, close to 60% who could register did vote. And it's lower in Lebanon for two reasons. One, people have tired of voting for people who do nothing for them. But two, the numbers are inaccurate in Lebanon. In other words, 40% of what, if you look at Sidon, for example, many of the people, according to our data and the data that was shared with me by a colleague and friend who was elected there, 1 out of 3 people who are registered as residents no longer live there. They're actually abroad. So Lebanon needs a new census of who's actually living in the country to better understand it. But clearly, if you look at the preliminary polls that I've seen, the diaspora is more optimistic, feels more strongly about voting, is more likely to vote for non-aligned candidates, and is more positive in the short, intermediate, and long term that something good will happen. So those are the data that I've seen from our Islam Affairs Institute and others. That's the divide. People in the country, including our own community, need to be pushed and encouraged to continue to exercise their civic responsibility and to vote.
Thank you. We have many questions coming in online, so I'm going to try to go through maybe 2 at a time and address them. Mona, how can the Magnitsky Law, ICC, and other international organizations or conventions help eradicate corruption and disregard to the rule of law in Lebanon and bring those accountable to justice? So
I don't see a role for the ICC, but certainly Magnitsky Act sanctions, and they were referenced in the congressman's keynote as well, can play a role. As I said, I think the answer is not sanctions, and I take David's point that you can't have sanctions as a substitute for policy, but as an integral part of policy in which there's a clear roadmap and decision made that targeted sanctions, very clearly travel bans and asset freezes of key individuals, that can make a difference, and I think that's exactly the road that needs to be pursued. Understanding, though, there has to be a broader plan and alternatives in the wings ready to step in and put Lebanon on the right path.
thank you. Alain, if I can go to you, what purely Lebanese action can civil society start with, given the complexity and scale of the problems, and what is a practical and realistic approach?
Well, many things can be done because it's a total desert in Lebanon nowadays when it comes to political initiatives. But for a start, for instance, one can imagine that civil society would start propose laws instead of waiting for MPs who don't. And I'm talking here about things that relate to the crisis in which we are, the use of hydrocarbons, should we find any in the Mediterranean, and others. Also, the civil society has, a role to play in stepping in when it comes to giving the right information. I'm not sure nor confident that a lot of media in Lebanon are still doing so in a very professional way. And we've seen some media, for instance, take people like sheep to being slaughtered while convincing them that that was the right way. And at the same time, there is significant pressure that is required for the judiciary system to reform itself one way or another. I'm trying to talk about the very essential items where checks and balances can make a big difference. Of course, as many speakers say, it is going to be very challenging to achieve any kind of significant reform in Lebanon if we don't combine at the same time local pressure with sustained international pressure. We've seen the Lebanese try to do a lot by themselves, and one has to commend them for still having the energy 50 years after the beginning of their nightmare to do so. But if it is not met by international support, it doesn't work. And vice versa. We've seen at various moments in time a significant mobilization of the Friends of Lebanon in the world, but that wasn't matched for many reasons by a popular pressure coming from Lebanon. And in these windows of opportunities where we can imagine that both kinds of pressure exist, this is when one can start pushing for significant reforms to take place. And once again, it is one thing to pass a law in Lebanon, and it's another thing to make it, I would say, to enforce it and to make sure that we are establishing things that are not reversible in a very short period of time.
Thank you. And we're really running out of time, but I do have a very strong question from Ali Mbayed, Chief Economist at Jefferies. I'm going to turn it to you, Ambassador Hale. The paper advocates what ideally should be done to save the state of Lebanon. But what about if that collapses and it's no longer can be saved? What should the international community do if those in charge allow the state to collapse in order to continue to consolidate power?
Well, in many ways, we're almost there. I'm not sure what a more fully collapsed state of Lebanon would look like at this stage. Certainly, if the army were to somehow disintegrate, that would be an enormously dangerous signal, but I don't believe it's going to happen. I think there's a strong will to stay strong and united within the army and substantial support internationally for it. So I think what you would see in that scenario is just further fragmentation where people, as they are now, turn to a black market economy, which only empowers corrupt people who can deliver security and goods in that kind of an environment. So it just feeds this kind of fragmented, sectarian-driven little mini-states everywhere, which is where, again, I'm not an advocate for it, but the idea of federalism comes in as an antidote somewhat to that. It's like it says, well, okay, the viable solution to disintegration may be to find a way to do it that actually serves people's needs in a structured fashion. And so I think that's what inspires that debate anyway.
But you don't fear a scenario of Lebanon turning into Haiti?
Well, No, I think Lebanon's own sort of pathologies will be what you see, and we're seeing it already. But I think the army will retain a basic level of security for the foreseeable future, and sadly enough, also Hezbollah in areas that it controls. Instead, what I see is people turning more and more to local power centers for security and services.
Thank you. Well, this was a really excellent panel from my end, listening to our great panelists. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully next one we're all in person, Washington, or maybe Beirut. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the rest of your day. I'm gonna turn it over to Marissa, however, now to go on with the rest of the program.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you so much to all the panelists for a very enriching conversation. Of course, this was all recorded, and for those of you who want to rewatch it or access the paper, this will be available online. We'll be taking a short break and returning later on with Ethan Goldrich, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary with the Near Eastern Bureau at the State Department, followed by the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry of Qatar. There is coffee actually this time around. It's not virtual coffee, as I announced earlier. So please grab a coffee. We'll take a mini break, and we will return in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doris. Welcome back, everyone, to the Middle East Programs Conference, Building Lebanon's Sovereignty and the State. We are honored to be hosting Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs from the State Department, Mr. Ethan Goldrich. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. So I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Hale to lead this first fireside chat. I believe you will have some remarks to begin with, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, why don't we turn directly to our distinguished visitor. I know you have some comments to make, and then we can begin our dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Hale. I was trying to imagine what a fireside chat looks like in July, so now I know. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with the group today. I already see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm sure there are more out there listening to us on streaming, so this is a good chance for me to talk to you about U.S. policy in Lebanon, and appreciate also being part of an event with so many other distinguished participants. The white paper that you've been discussing is timely and calls out the urgent need for Lebanon to elect a president, form a government, and make the reforms necessary to secure an IMF program. These are certainly the priorities that we as the U.S. government share. As Ambassador Leaf noted when she articulated the Biden-Harris administration's approach to Lebanon here at the Wilson Center last November, over the past decade, U.S. policy regarding Lebanon has sought to limit the threats posed by malign actors, bolster Lebanon's ability to protect its borders, and build a state capacity to deal with the compounding crises facing the country, including the current economic crisis. Fundamentally, this economic crisis was created by a system of corruption and mismanagement that has plagued Lebanon for decades. This systemic corruption continues to stymie Lebanon's ability to move past the crisis. Living standards have plummeted. People cannot withdraw their hard-earned savings from banks. Businesses have shuttered their doors. Skyscrapers have gone dark. More and more critical positions of authority remain unfilled, and thousands of Lebanon's best and brightest have left to pursue opportunities outside of Lebanon. What Lebanon needs is real progress, and in order to do this, it's critical that Lebanon elect a president and form an empowered government committed to supporting its people. It's unacceptable that Lebanon remains locked in a political stalemate that is preventing any meaningful progress on essential reforms needed to unlock an IMF program and put the country on the road to recovery. And Lebanon's leaders must learn to put the interests of their people ahead of their own personal ambitions. While the political situation remains stagnant, our administration has not stood idly by, and we are committed to real solutions for the Lebanese people. We remain committed to Lebanon's sovereignty as we press the country's leadership to adopt a sense of urgency in meeting the critical needs of its people. While it is for Lebanon's elected leaders to form their own government, the United States believes Lebanon needs a president free of corruption and someone who can unite the country, advocate for transparency and accountability, put the interests of Lebanon's people first, move toward national unity, and implement critical economic reforms, chief among those required to secure an IMF program. In the interim, the United States is focusing on putting a floor underneath the risk of state collapse. For us, that means continuing to provide assistance to the most vulnerable in Lebanon, both Lebanese and refugees, supporting the Lebanese armed forces and the internal security forces as central pillars to domestic stability and security, and helping UNIFIL as it seeks to fulfill its mandate under UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and to serve as a key actor in mitigating the risk of escalation along the blue line. As the economic situation worsens and the political stalemate continues, we have seen a very concerning intensification in anti-refugee rhetoric from Lebanese politicians who seek to deflect blame for their role in the economic collapse. And we understand the strains that large refugee population can put on Lebanon, but again, we look to try to help deal with those strains and don't see it appropriate for the kind of rhetoric that sometimes comes out, and that rhetoric must stop. We continue to encourage the Lebanese government to constructively engage with the UN to work toward durable solutions for refugees. While the road ahead will be difficult, the United States remains committed to supporting the Lebanese people. Further, the government of Lebanon has proved itself capable of progress, notably with the historic maritime boundary agreement with Israel. This took courage and demonstrated to us that when Lebanon's leaders work together, they can accomplish meaningful impact. So, Ambassador Hale, thank you again for this chance to discuss how the United States can best work to help Lebanon on a better path.
Well, thank you very much, Ethan. Appreciate hearing your presentation on U.S. foreign policy toward Lebanon. I mean, one of the challenges you mentioned is that while the presidential vacancy is right in front of everyone's face, there are deeper systemic problems at foot here. And one of the things we heard from many of the panelists this morning was the observation that, in fact, most of the people who are now in power, the last thing they want to see, of course, is reform of a system that has put them there. So how do you move beyond sort of the goals that you outlined into actually implementing them and shaking up the system in Lebanon sufficiently that you can see the kind of change that's going to be needed to stabilize it?
Thanks. So we think it's pretty vital to be able to move forward to where the reforms, starting with the IMF reforms, can be implemented. The selection of the president is the key move because without leadership in place, there's not much that can go forward, and the selection of the president sets in motion the selection of the other leadership, including the prime minister and the government. The IMF, the actions that the IMF has require parliamentary action that is being held up because of the current situation. So we really are focused on that first set of things that need to happen. I actually was at the meeting on Monday in Doha, what they call a Quint meeting, where other countries that also are looking at how we can help Lebanon move forward, shared views, and I think kind of the pressure coming from other countries that have Lebanon's best interests in mind, and the coordination that we're doing with them also, I think helps move us toward where we're in a position to press for the decisions that need to be made and the implementation of the reforms that need to be made. But it's very clear that if we can't move Lebanon into the stage where it's actually implementing reforms, then we're just prolonging the situation that got us to where we are right now. And I think certainly, from the perspective of the 5 countries that met the other day, and probably from the perspective of a lot of other people, and certainly from the perspective of people inside Lebanon, it's time to end the corruption and the mismanagement that brought Lebanon to where it is right now, and really introduce systemic changes that'll put it on a different path. So when it comes out of the crisis, it won't be in danger of reverting to where it was before.
Well, thank you. So appreciate your comment on the Quint meeting, which got everyone's attention, and knowing you can't reveal any diplomatic secrets, but I think the audience would be very interested if you could elaborate a bit on what some of the concerns you heard among the Quint members, and particularly, is there a plan or an idea of moving beyond a statement of goals, which was good in the communique, to actually practical steps on the ground to help move Lebanon toward the solutions you outlined?
So first of all, it was important, I think, for the 5 countries to get together. We have a lot of overlap in how we see the problem and the solutions that we see as necessary. And each country also has a long history of partnership and support for Lebanon. So we're all approaching the issue with Lebanon's best interests in mind. I think many of you probably saw the joint statement that came out at the end of the meeting. So the joint statement, again, it shows that we're very much focused on the need to select the president and then the prime minister and the government, and the need to implement the IMF reforms. The joint statement also made very clear reference to the port blast investigation and the need for the rule of law, and to allow an independent judiciary to be able to do its work. And it also included reference to concrete options for, if necessary, implementing measures against anyone who's blocking the process of selecting leadership in Lebanon. So this was a good chance for us to articulate what the Quint is thinking about and urging on Lebanon. I think many of you are aware we met in Paris in February and didn't issue a formal public statement. This statement came out right away within hours of the completion of the meeting. So I think there's no mystery about where our focus was in the course of the meeting, and then we'll look forward to seeing what plays out over the next few months, and in advance of future meeting by the same group of countries. And but I think that reference to the concrete options and, if necessary, implementing measures against people who are blocking the election should be a message to people to move the election process forward, so that the next time these countries convene to discuss the situation, it shouldn't be exactly the same situation that we were looking at on Monday.
Very helpful, thank you. So the elephant in any room when you're talking about Lebanon, of course, is Hezbollah. And I think it's important, a good opportunity for us to hear from you on the administration's approach. The theme of our white paper and of this conference is building stability, building sovereignty, and the Lebanese state, which is easy to talk about, harder to do. And Hezbollah is one of the major impediments that is draining away the sovereignty of Lebanon. And we were asked this morning by a very, Randa Slim, a very well-known analyst, so how do we square that circle? How can you actually talk about sovereignty in the state in ways in which you can actually, at least, if not incentivize Hezbollah to stop blocking it, to minimize its opportunities to do so? And I know this has been a long-term project in the United States, and we'd love to hear from you on it.
Yeah, so of course, this administration remains as concerned at what Hezbollah has done and is doing in Lebanon as all of our previous administrations. The larger administration policy toward the region, I think, also encompasses things that we're doing in Lebanon and about Hezbollah and malign activity from Hezbollah inside Lebanon. So I think probably many of you are familiar that the administration policy toward the Middle East includes elements of diplomacy, deterrence, partnership, integration, and values, and certainly the issue of Hezbollah would fall under the principle of deterrence, that we need to deter activity that will further destabilize Lebanon, destabilize neighboring countries, because we're keenly aware that Lebanon is strategically located right in between Israel and Syria, and things that happen in Lebanon can play out over the wider region. So certainly, the sanctions that Hezbollah-related sanctions that we have in place are part of our deterrence, trying to cut off financial flows, trying to ensure Hezbollah's malign activities beyond Lebanon, try to interfere and stop that kind of activity as well. So looking at the south, we're certainly aware of the recent reports about incidents around the Blue Line, and the tent that UNIFIL has identified south of the Blue Line as a Security Council Resolution 1701 violation. So we're quite vocal in calling for de-escalation and calling for allowing UNIFIL to be able to do its job and to access all the areas around the Blue Line that it needs to access. We're very aware of the so-called NGO called Green Without Borders. It is an excuse for also putting things down around the Blue Line that don't belong there, and Hezbollah is responsible for that as well. So I think we're going to remain vocal in calling out the things that they shouldn't be doing, both in Lebanon and across the region, and also vocal about any activity that is blocking the political progress inside of Lebanon, that they should not be an obstacle to all the other parties in Lebanon that I think would like to move forward through a political selection process and get into place a presidency so the country can start moving out of crisis.
Thank you, Ethan. Of course, one of the challenges is that it seems over time the momentum and the initiative has been held by Hezbollah and their Iranian allies, so it's a tough challenge. And you noted the uptick in tension in the south, also on Gajar. It raises a question. I think we heard from Representative Darren LaHood this morning of his hope that the successful negotiation of the maritime line, which you also mentioned, could be extended to efforts on the land side as well. Is there any progress or a hope for that?
Yes, thank you for referencing that as well. So I went through all the different principles of the administration's Middle East policy, and the principle of integration, I think, is the one that covers what's been done so far on the maritime boundary. which, as I pointed out in the formal remarks, was really important achievement, really important indication that people inside Lebanon, leaders inside Lebanon, can wrap themselves around the problem and move toward a solution. I think on that one, we were able to demonstrate on both sides of that boundary that there were national interests for each side in coming to conclusion on that agreement, that it was in each country's interests to reach conclusion on an agreement. And so we were very happy that they were able to see that themselves and move forward into an agreement that should have clear benefits for both Israel and for Lebanon. And the discussion that we were just having on the blue line and the difficulties with Hezbollah in the south and the blue line, those many of those issues would be resolved if there was a clearly demarcated land boundary between Israel and Lebanon. So while I don't have any specific news to report to you on how that would move forward, I think certainly moving forward on demarcating a land boundary between Israel and Lebanon would help stabilize the issues in the south, remove some of the opportunities for malign activity down there. So I think we should look at the example of the maritime boundary as something everybody thought was, so difficult and didn't think it could be accomplished, and now we can put it in the category of things that have already been done, and now we can look at what's left of the land boundary demarcation that needs to be completed as another very achievable goal, and certainly one that fits into our administration's policy of integration in the region.
Excellent. So we just have time for one more question. If I could raise the issue of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, which has been a tremendous burden and, of course, tremendous humanitarian problem for the refugees themselves. We did hear a suggestion this morning about sort of elevating international engagement on this question with a sort of task force approach of the various actors who are involved in this. What is the administration's thinking at present on this?
So we're keenly aware that Lebanon is under a society that already has a domestic crisis in progress, a domestic economic crisis going on, and then carries the additional strain of hosting a very large number of refugees from elsewhere. And there's great appreciation for what Lebanon has done over the years in hosting this population. But there's also an awareness that the real solution to the Syrian refugee problem, not just in Lebanon, but Turkey and Jordan and elsewhere, is changing the conditions inside Syria so people would feel comfortable going back there. At the moment, it's clear that the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees, the conditions don't exist inside Syria for that to happen. There are perhaps small numbers of people that want to go back, and if people want to go back, they should go back, but the large numbers of people that each country is hosting, including Lebanon, are not able to go back. So I think we through our embassy in Beirut are in touch with UNHCR and with the Lebanese government, and we're largest donor providing support for the refugees that are in Lebanon. We also separately provide support for the neediest people inside Lebanon. I think we had $400 million in humanitarian support this past year for the very needy people inside Lebanon, separate from the support that we provide to the Syrian refugees. So as the United States, we're doing everything we can for both sets of population that are in need, but through our embassy, we are talking to UNHCR and to the Lebanese government on what we can do to help with what's clearly a strain on the society in Lebanon hosting the large numbers of people. And so, listening to what people are saying on what the challenges for Lebanon trying to look for solutions. But again, those solutions have to be within the bounds of the international humanitarian law and the reality of what the refugees would face if they went back to Syria and why they're still in Lebanon.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great honor to have you.
Okay. Thank you so much for hosting me, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much once again, Das Goldrich, for your time today. I am looking forward to welcoming Dr. Majid Al-Ansari, who is currently advisor to the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs in Qatar and the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry in Qatar. Dr. Al-Ansari, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us from Doha.
Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm very glad to virtually see and hear all of you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Majid. There you are. I wondered if you wanted an opportunity to make some comments before we start, or should I just jump in with a few questions? We're all very interested, of course, in what happened in Doha during the Quint meeting this week.
Yes, Ambassador. If you allow me, I'd like to start with shedding some light over the meeting that took place here in Doha on Monday. And let me first begin by extending our gratitude to the Wilson Center and its esteemed team for hosting the significant event on Lebanon, with a special appreciation to you, Ambassador Hale, for taking the lead in this discussion, but also for the exemplary leadership in raising awareness about Lebanon and its current situation in Washington. This is especially important now, as you all will know, as Lebanon is a country that sometimes is overlooked in policymaking in Washington, D.C., while we all undeniably would agree that the stability and security of Lebanon is vital to the prosperity of the Middle East. So let me start off by sharing with you some insight about the meeting that took place here in Doha 2 days ago. And I apologize, there might be some repetition to what the previous speaker, Das Goldrich, said on the issue, but I hope it would act also as a reminder of what was said, but also to focus on the intricacies of the meeting itself. So this meeting, as most of you would know, follows the first meeting of the quintet in February. The first meeting did not result in a communique or a joint statement between parties that convened at the time. There were some disagreements over the language and other issues. Thankfully, at this meeting, the communique proved that we were able to counter these disagreements and find common ground in order to show the various Lebanese parties that we can speak with one voice, the 5 countries, on the issue in Lebanon. The current crisis in Lebanon, of course, as said before, goes beyond the presidential elections, encompassing economic difficulties and the Israeli aggression on the Lebanese border, such as the recent occupation of Rajab village, which was just mentioned. And the meeting in Doha was paramount in addressing Lebanon's multifaceted challenges and devising a comprehensive roadmap for their resolutions. The parties, as you all just heard, called on all political factions in Lebanon to assume their responsibilities, work within the constitution, and end the paralysis of the state institutions while addressing pressing social and economic issues. The election of a president is deemed critical for unifying the country, defending its constitution, and rebuilding trust within the international community. The Lebanese president has a role that is not only seen in its constitutional format, but also in unifying the country, transparently implementing reforms, and prioritizing the interests of the Lebanese people. The parties urgently called on the Lebanese parliament to elect a president and called on the international community to respect Lebanon's sovereignty and take action against those obstructing its political process. The meeting underscored the need to support Lebanon's stability and reform through various means, including urgent and effective responses to crises and long-term technical assistance in such areas as military security forces, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and energy. And the joint statement released during the meeting highlighted key areas, including supporting Lebanon's stability and reform, through technical assistance, agreeing on concepts of joint international action, and emphasizing the importance of strengthening security in Lebanon. Along with being the first meeting since February and issuing a joint statement, what makes the Doha meeting different than others? One of the main issues there is the highlight on supporting Lebanon's stability and reform through technical assistance, agreeing on the concepts of joint international action, because one of the main challenges, as we all know in Lebanon, was what was deemed to be proxy infighting that is happening in Lebanon through countries like Iran and even other regional players that certainly has put more fuel on the fire over there. And discussing ways to support the Lebanese cause internationally after its political stability. That said, it's like a stick and carrot discussion, the carrot being the commitment to support Lebanon economically and politically post electing a president, while the stick being saying that anybody who is an obstacle to consensus in Lebanon will be penalized by the international community represented by the Quintet, and developing future plan for the 5-year action regarding Lebanon. Let me reflect a little bit on how Qatar sees this issue. So we have always given strong support to fill the presidential vacancy and ensure Lebanon's stability, as the existing presidential vacuum can lead to a further political turmoil and social collapse. And we recently also welcomed concluding the boundary agreement between Israel and Lebanon, and we said that we need to capitalize on what this moment generated. After Lebanon and Israel signed a US-mediated maritime border agreement, Qatari Energy Minister Saad Sharid Al-Kaabi joined Lebanese officials in Beirut for a ceremony, inking an agreement for Qatar to take a 30% share in the consortium for oil and gas exploration in Lebanese waters. This important agreement gives the state of Qatar an opportunity to support economic development in Lebanon during this critical time. On the economic side, we have always supported that the International Monetary Fund's program presents a viable option to overcome the economic crisis, and we advocate for economic reforms aligned with the IMF's recommendation. Along with that, combating corruption, both domestically and internationally, is of utmost importance, and measures must be taken to prevent its persistence. And the search for sustainable solutions to the energy crisis is imperative, and Qatar encourages the formation of a coalition of international companies to invest in Lebanon in issues relating to energy. And while the notion of imposing sanctions on Lebanon to address the presidential vacancy is occasionally mentioned, it is crucial to recognize that such sanctions primarily harm the people and have proven to be ineffective. When it comes to our assistance in Lebanon, ever since the Doha Agreement in 2008 and prior to that, Qatar has been dedicated to supporting the Lebanese people as part of its Arab fraternal and humanitarian commitment. Qatar has provided vital economic assistance to the Lebanese people, helping to pay salaries for the Lebanese armies and security forces with the sum of $60 million. 70 tons of food supplies monthly for 1 year were also offered to the army to make sure that we limit desert in the army, and support from the Qatari Development Fund to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, covering the cost of fuel for a number of health facilities in Lebanon. If we go back to 2020, His Highness the Emir pledged sum of $50 million to assist and support by Beirut and Lebanese people following the Beirut port exploding. To sum up, today's enlightening discussions have shed crucial light on the political and economic challenges faced by Lebanon, and the state of Qatar remains at the forefront of supporting Lebanon and its people during these difficult times. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Majid. That's wonderful to hear such a comprehensive overview of what happened this week in Doha and of the perspective of your government. The leadership that Qatar has shown in terms of offering mediation opportunities for Lebanon is well known, as well as your steady engagement in the country. So I think all of us seeking solutions are grateful for that. I wonder, without asking you to reveal any diplomatic confidences, perhaps you could shed some light on what kind of reaction you've heard, if any, yet from Lebanese actors, and what kind of follow-up steps we might anticipate in the wake of the communique.
Well, Ambassador, of course, as you know, it's quite early to gauge the response from the Lebanese side at the moment. However, we have had a lot of positive communication with various Lebanese figures, and we were following, the media outpour regarding the meeting coming from Lebanon. There is a lot of hope that is related to the joint communique, and I think the message went very clear over there. And the next steps now would include, first and foremost, a joint message by the five countries. I think one of the main things that was agreed upon during the meeting is that the five countries would send similar messages through their representatives to the various parties in Lebanon, making sure that they understand that this is only now one message coming from the quintet, and an agreement that would make sure that there are no party in Lebanon or abroad can play on the minute differences between these powers. So I think that probably is the main outcome here, is that there is now an agreement on how to work together, where we can work together, and that there should be one message coming from the international community: elect a president now and reforms to follow, and there's no other way around the current crisis.
Very clear, and certainly very valuable to have that unity, and I know everyone will seek to maintain that unity and maintain the pressure on Hezbollah. Any signs yet on timeline on the energy situation? I appreciate your comment about the inking of the deal. What's next?
Well, we made it very clear to the Lebanese side that without a president, without an elected government with a clear mandate, and without implementing economic reforms in line with the IMF's program, it would be very difficult for any outside investor and state sponsors of Lebanon to act positively towards what's going on now in Lebanon. And the feasibility of exploring for energy sources right now in Lebanon, of course, is not seen with the current crisis. So, and we believe that this is, as I said, is the carrot in the joint statement, that everybody is willing to support Lebanon. These five countries are committed to supporting Lebanon economically. Only after a president has been elected and we pass the threshold of this constitutional crisis, but also with a government that is clearly committed to implementing the economic reforms that the joint statement talked about.
Well, that's a very juicy carrot, so I'm glad to hear it being deployed so well. I think we've come to the end of our time here today. Dr. Majid, is there any concluding thought you'd like to offer our group before we go?
Well, I'd like to reiterate what I said in the beginning. Lebanon is at many times neglected in the discussions of foreign policy in Washington, and I cannot stress enough how important the work that you do and the center does on raising level of awareness on Lebanon is in DC and around the world. And we are hopeful that through the discussions here, we can give more insight for decision makers to understand the gravity of the situation in Lebanon. And we hope to see more being done, not only in the US, but internationally, not only in applying pressure in Lebanon, but also in making the Lebanese people see the light at the end of the tunnel and paving the way through consensus.
Very helpful, Dr. Majid. Wonderful to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Majid, Ambassador Hale. Thank you, and thanks to all of our audience in person and online for joining us today. This concludes our half-day conference on Lebanon, building Lebanon's sovereignty and the state. Once again, the policy paper we published this morning is online. If you're here, you can QR code it. And we look forward to continuing the discussion on Lebanon under the Lebanon Ideas Forum here at the Wilson Center. So thank you very much.
Thank you.